So today I'm going to be speaking with you about a topic of kind of increasing interest to me, the wildlife benefits of native shrubs. So I started getting into this a couple years ago and sort of continued that progression of interest. And this year I'm trying to propagate some of those native shrubs. So basically, in this talk, I'm going to go through a series of different native shrubs and talk about some of the insects and wildlife that benefit from using those shrubs, either in your landscaping or in a natural area, or in some cases, even in pots that you might have available. So first off, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the considerations you might have before choosing different native shrubs for your site. These include things like climate, soil, sun, shade, and moisture, more personal preferences, the attractiveness, flowers and foliage, where you might be placing these shrubs, whether it's in a forest restoration type site or within your landscaping. And then the main topic of today, the wildlife value and the different things that are going to benefit from you using those. So as this is the Southern Illinois Conservation Workshop, we're probably mostly concentrated here on the southern tip of Illinois. So that includes the hardiness zone 6 and a little bit of 7. So that's something you might want to check and make sure the shrubs that you're looking at for your site can tolerate that climactic zone. And I'm not going to get into too much detail about soils, but I did want to mention this one resource that is pretty simple to use and can give you sort of a generalized idea of what soils you might have available on your site. And it's really easy to use. It's called the Web Soil Survey. And you can see here sort of the home page screen, and you basically click on the little green button there on the web page, and it'll take you through a couple of questions, and you outline the area of interest, and it will feed you a soil report. And then the second resource I have mentioned on this slide is the soil series information. So the soils report that the Web Soil Survey will develop will tell you the soil types that are present in your site or on your site, and then you might have to then navigate to the soil series information to find some more useful information about those soil types. So here's an example of a couple of pages from a soil report from my place in Marion. And you can see the map on the right has the soil type number 376A, and it basically is the entirety of my yard. So not very complex in this case, which means I don't have a very diverse options for different soil types and what plants might be best suited to those. But so if we go on to look at some further detail there, we see that that soil type 376A is a Sisney silt loam. And if you look up the soil series, then that gives you some additional useful information here, such as what the use and vegetation is. So one of the things that I look at under the series information is the vegetation type, and oftentimes, but not always, they'll tell you what the native vegetation is, because most of our landscape here in Illinois has been converted in one way or another. But in my case, or in this case, you have that this site was originally native vegetation was prairie grasses with some widely spaced trees in places. And it also tells you that it is poorly drained, slowly or very slowly permeable soils, which I've discovered after our torrential downpours in the spring. A lot of times I'll have standing pools of water, and then this time of year when everything is dried out and there's not a lot of precipitation, it is very hard and dried out soil. So it can be a fairly dramatic difference depending on the time of year. Then another thing I use these to look for are the acidity or alkalinity of the soil. As you go down in the soil description, and you'll see here that this soil type goes from moderately acidic, and as you go deeper in depth, it becomes more strongly acidic. So that tells me I'm not gonna probably plant something that doesn't tolerate acidity, or if I do want to do something like that, I'll know that I probably need to add some sort of soil amendment to reduce that. Now these, again, this is sort of painting with a broad brush. If you really want to know in great detail what your composition of your soil is and what characteristics it has, you would do a soil test. And that's a little beyond what I want to talk about today, but that is an option for you. Before I get into this, I did want to mention a little bit about the use of native species versus non-native species. I know this can be kind of controversial, but to me, the benefits of using native species far outweigh any additional benefit you might get from using non-native. So natives are going to generally be more useful to wildlife, and their observation can help reverse insect and bird declines. Most of you are probably aware that of the recent study that showed dramatic declines in bird abundance across North America. This could be one way to improve habitat and help to reverse some of those declines. Of course, the non-native species, not all of them, but some of them have potential to become invasive, and we want to avoid that. Of course, the native plants are going to be generally more useful as nectar and pollen resources, more suitable for nesting sites and cover, and a lot of wildlife are adapted to use native resources versus the non-natives. And one thing you do need to consider if you're just diving into the use of natives in your landscaping is that you may have to reframe your thinking of pests. You know, one of the great things about using native shrubs is that your plants are going to be host to a lot of caterpillars and other insects that traditionally might be thought of as a negative, but really that's going to serve as food for a lot of birds and other wildlife going on up the food chain. So one really great resource that I've come across while getting into this is the Native Plant Finder. Here's the web page for that. If you're not familiar, this Native Plant Finder was developed by the National Wildlife Federation and some other partners, and it's based on Doug Tallamy's work related to some of his work that went into the Bringing Nature Home book that a lot of you might be familiar with. So one of the cool things about this resource is that you can specify your location and it will give you results specific to your zip code in terms of which plant species will be native to your region, but then also it will feed you numbers of insects that use those plants as host plants. So I know we're not talking about trees today, but one of the reasons you might hear a lot of people telling you to plant oak trees for insect diversity is they are highly supportive of a huge number of insect caterpillars and such. So 456 different insect species use oaks as a host plant. And this is going to be specific to your zip code. So if I typed in, so this was for Marion, Illinois, if you typed in zip code from a slightly different area, the numbers are going to change somewhat. So that's kind of cool too. And with that, I'm going to jump into the specific species and some of the wildlife that use them. So up first, we have the Downy Serviceberry, which could be considered a shrub or a tree up to about 30 feet. And if you're not aware, the reason it's called Serviceberry is back in olden times, they used to use the bloom period of this shrub or tree to know when they could, when the ground would be thawed out enough for people who had passed away in the winter that they could dig the grave for those folks, and that was going to be the right time for it. So this plant is best in partial shade and can be stressed in full sun, prefers well drained, slightly alkaline to acidic loam or sand. This plant, according to the plant finder, attracts 91 species of butterflies and moths and is host to caterpillars of the striped hair streak. There's an image of that. And red-spotted purple and several moths, and as well as a diversity of bees, flies, and beetles. And then over 30 different bird species will feed on the berries. So it's not just a function of the plant serving as a host plant for different insects. The plants themselves produce edible parts and other parts that are going to be used by wildlife in different ways. So another big way that this plant is going to be used is from the berries being used as food. Up next, we have the wild hydrangea. So this is kind of a smaller statured shrub, generally 3 to 8 feet with unbranched canes. And it has these really cool flower structures in these flat panicles, if you've ever come across them. It prefers dappled sunlight and light shade and consistently damp to moderately acid to neutral soil with organic matter. So this is one that has a fairly, a little bit more specific requirements. So this one would not work in my yard, for example. But it might in yours, depending on the conditions. It does prefer a more humid area with protection from wind as well. So this one serves as host to 10 different species of butterflies and moths. One of the more interesting here, to me anyway, is the Hydrangea sphinx. The sphinx moths as a group are just these large, sort of unique and oftentimes colorful moths. And then it also serves as a nectar and pollen resource for a number of different bees and wasps, as well as some beetles and flies. Common elderberry. So this one is another one of my favorites. Although it is quite common in the wild, it can be a really nice addition to your yard as well. This one is a deciduous plant up to 12 feet. Prefers full to partial sun and moist and fertile loamy soil. It is short-lived, but is clonal, so as stems die back, new stems will come on. And it has these really great spring blooms and the fall berries, which I wish I had an image of those. They look really pretty cool with the really deep purple, dense clusters in the fall. So those are neat to see, as well as being useful to wildlife. So elderberry is the host to 29 different butterflies and moths. And one of the cool things about elderberry too is that the stems themselves are used for nesting for little carpenter bees and mason bees that kind of tunnel into those stems and make their home in the soft pith. So if you do end up getting some elderberry, you might want to consider leaving some of those stems over the winter. If you might otherwise cut them down, leave them over the winter and give them some time, and those will be used by these different insects. And then of course the pollen and vegetation of elderberry are used by a multitude of different insects. One of my favorites here, the bee fly. There's actually quite a few different bee flies, but just an interesting looking insect. So I really enjoyed this quote from exploringbirds.com. One of the best bird attracting plants in all of North America. So that kind of sums it up. Over 30 different species of birds will make use of the berries, and then also this one is pretty commonly used as a nesting site as well for several species. So a couple of my favorites here, the thrasher and the grosbeak there. So just to reiterate how popular common elderberry is, in addition to the insects and birds, lots of mammals and reptiles even will eat the fruits. A few of those pictured here, the fox squirrel, eastern box turtle, and eastern mud turtle, among others. Up next, we have buttonbush. So this one is another one that has a more distinct preference. It definitely prefers wet to moist soils. So if you have kind of a lower lying area, that would be kind of ideal for that, or a rain garden. But it can tolerate, I would say, up to mesic soils, just so that it's not super dried out. It is fairly tolerant of that. Has just these really cool orb-like clusters of flowers that I think are really attractive. And has a number of pretty interesting insects that make use of it. 24 different butterflies and moths. One of the moths that I thought were kind of interesting here is the beautiful wood nymph, and the name is somewhat ironic because I've read that it is actually mimicking a piece of bird poo so that it doesn't get noticed by predators. Yet it is quite beautiful there as well. So buttonbush is used by a whole suite of different bees, from honeybees through a lot of the other natives that you see listed here. Also a number of flies, beetles, and other larvae, including some specific to the buttonbush leaf beetle, for example, and the buttonbush sphinx. So buttonbush in a more natural habitat especially can serve as a fall and winter food source for a number of wetland birds. The common grackle and the king rail will occasionally use it as a nesting site. It is, however, poisonous to livestock, so you may want to avoid it in places where that might occur. But despite that, beavers and white-tailed deer somehow make use of it. Not sure how that works exactly. Why that would be different. Up next is another one of my favorites, the false indigo or indigo bush. This is a 4 to 16 foot tall shrub. This one prefers full or partial sun and wet to moist conditions, but this is another one, even though it prefers more moisture, I've seen it in some pretty upland sites as well, and it does just fine. It has this dense flower arrangement, as you see in the image. And if you're familiar with another plant, the lead plant, it's more of a prairie wildflower. That's a cousin of the indigo bush, and people have described it as a lead plant on steroids. So just much taller, more robust. This is one that I'm hoping to propagate coming up here. I just collected some seeds, and we'll see how that goes. So the indigo bush, or false indigo, is host to 35 species of butterflies and moths. I have an image here, the masked bee, one of the native bees that'll make use of it. It's also host to the silver-spotted skipper, dog-faced sulfur, black-spotted prominent, common tan wave, and a number of birds will make use of the seeds. Goldfinch, sparrow, titmice, and juncos. Up next, we have the fragrant sumac, Rhus aromatica. So this one prefers full or partial sun, dry, sandy, or rocky soils, or mesic soils with fertile, loamy soil. This one can be 2 to 8 feet tall. And if you're not familiar with it, fragrant sumac, it's called that for a reason. If you crush one of the leaves up, it has a really nice kind of citrusy-ish smell to it, I would say. Some people confuse this one for poison ivy, so that is something you want to look out for before you go picking a leaf and crushing it up and putting it up towards your face. But I think the berries are pretty attractive. They're kind of these little red fuzzy balls there that come out in the fall. Some of the insects that will make use of sumac. So that's another thing I forgot to mention. The native plant finder that I use to come up with these numbers of different host plant species that use these plants for hosts. A lot of times they're not looking at specific plant species. So in this case, the plant finder used Rhus, the Rhus genus, which is all of the native sumacs, to say that 49 species of butterflies and moths are making use of that. So it may not be that they're using a particular species, but they're using some of the species within that genus for sure. Just want to make that distinction. So a couple of the interesting insects here include the spring azure that's pictured, and then the regal moth, which is quite regal to be sure. Oops. And as far as use of fragrant sumac by birds in terms of the berries, it's not a preferred food source for a lot of birds. It is sometimes used as sort of an emergency food source during the winter when there's not much else available. The white-tailed deer will sometimes browse the stems and leaves, and cottontails will gnaw at the bark in the winter. Up next, we have another pretty fragrant shrub, the spicebush. This one can be 5 to 15 feet tall and prefers dappled sunlight to medium shade and moist to mesic and fertile loamy soil with organic matter. And this is another one that has a really great aromatic smell when you crush the leaves or the berries as well. And this one is kind of a wild edible, although I haven't really seen people eating it exactly, but using it to make tea, for example, or even came across someone who was using it to flavor ice cream. Something that I've considered. Haven't pulled the trigger on that yet, but I will let you know if I do. And basically what they do is they make a sort of a tea, or they somehow extract the flavor and the essence of it. They don't actually eat part of the plant at all. In terms of wildlife, famously it is host to the Spicebush swallowtail, which has this really cool caterpillar with those fake out eye spots that can fool predators into thinking it's kind of a larger organism or something that's a little less attractive to be going after for a meal. So that one's pretty cool. And another really cool one that uses spicebush, the Prometheus silk moth. These are just huge moths if you've ever come across them. Really, really fun to see. And the caterpillars are also pretty interesting to see as well, as you see in the image. And in addition, the fruits are eaten by quite a few different birds, including some of our kind of iconic songbirds. The eastern kingbird, great crested flycatcher, and hermit thrush are pictured here. Up next, we have the rough-leaved dogwood. This is another one that could be considered a shrub or a small tree up to 20 feet. Prefers partial sun and moist to slightly dry loam, clay loam, or rocky soils, so pretty variable. I really like the berries pictured there in the top right. I think they're pretty attractive in and of themselves. So dogwoods, which is a fairly decent sized group, Cornus genus, hosts 102 species of butterflies and moths, so that's pretty significant. One of the more interesting ones, I saw somebody posted one of these on Facebook the other day, a funerary dagger moth. Just really unique creature there that uses the dogwood. In addition, the flowers attract all sorts of honeybees, bumblebees, little carpenter bees. If you ever stop and look at one of these when they're blooming in the spring, it's just a frenzy of activity. So that's pretty fun to just kind of hang out and watch and see what different types of insects are making use of that. So a lot of different birds will make use of those fruits that we saw a minute ago, including bobwhite, wild turkey, purple finch pictured here, the evening grosbeak again, and the pine warbler, also pictured here. This next one, excuse me, this next one I really didn't think of as an sort of ornamental tree or shrub until I saw it mentioned on some websites. And the more I thought about it, the more, you know, it is a pretty interesting plant. So this could be considered a large shrub or a small tree. Can grow up to 30 feet, and I've seen them pretty close to that on occasion, but it has these really huge compound leaves. So this picture here is not one leaf, or is actually a picture of a single leaf, and it's these doubly compound leaves, and they can be 2 to 4 feet long and 1 to 3.5 feet across. So that's kind of interesting. And then you also have these spikes or these spines along the trunk of the stem, hence the name Devil's Walking Stick, or another common name, Hercules Club. So this one is pretty adaptable to a number of conditions of soil and sun. One thing to consider, people mention that the flowers and berries are not produced until the 3rd or 4th year, if not later. So if you're wanting instant gratification, this may not be the one for you. And it's also not a host plant of too many butterflies and moths, only 2 species mentioned on the plant finder. And but it does have numerous pollinating insects. There's another one kind of like that dogwood. If you check it out while it's blooming, you'll see all sorts of things, all sorts of insects making use of that resource. It does have abundant berries that are eaten by a lot of different birds and other wildlife, including black bears, which if you see one, let me know. And red fox, which I thought was kind of surprising, skunks and eastern chipmunks. And then the white-tailed deer will even browse that foliage despite some of those spines on there. Up next, we have the Blackhaw Viburnum. There are quite a few different native viburnum species, and really just chose one as an example. This is one of the more popular ones. This is a shrub or a small tree up to 15 feet, prefers light shade to partial sun, music to dry, loamy, clay loam, sandy loam, or somewhat rocky soils. So pretty wide range there of conditions that it'll tolerate. And this one blooms mid to late spring, which with these really abundant small white flowers. The viburnums as a genus host up to 91 butterflies and moths, so that's a pretty huge number there, including and then also a lot of different bees again, and flies will make use of the nectar and pollen resources. Up next, we have another of my real favorite shrubs down here. One of the common name is Hearts of Boston, also known as strawberry bush. This one is 6 to 12 feet tall, has ridged twigs, purplish, that can look purplish in the sun, has pale green flowers. The flowers themselves are not very showy, as you see there in the bottom right. The real attraction for this plant are the drupes, these red fruits with the orange seeds that kind of burst forth in the fall. And I'm not sure if they're doing that right now. If not, they're getting pretty close to kind of bursting open and putting on that show. One thing about strawberry bush or hearts of Boston is it's very attractive to deer. So depending on your objectives, you may want to plant a lot of this and attract deer if you're a hunter, or you may want to avoid this one if you're trying to avoid plants and you have deer that are being a nuisance in your yard. But I found this advertisement and just thought it was pretty funny, aka deer candy, aka ice cream plant for deer. So you know that they're gonna appreciate that one. In addition, so native euonymus, one thing I should mention here too is there are a couple of non-native invasive species in the euonymus genus. The two invasives are burning bush and winter creeper, the vine. So you do want to avoid those non-native invasives and go for one of the native euonymus. So the two main ones in our area are this hearts of Boston and then the eastern wahoo or the winged wahoo. You do want to be careful of the common names because some people interchange wahoo between the native and the non-native. So you do want to watch out for that if this is something you're considering. But the native euonymus is host to 14 species of butterflies and moths, including this one here. We have pictured the white-marked tussock moth and a number of others. And the berries are readily eaten by northern flickers, brown thrashers, catbirds, eastern bluebirds, cardinals, and eastern towhees, among others. Up next, we have Ninebark, which is pretty cool again. This is a 3 to 9 foot shrub, prefers full to partial sun, moist to dry, and loamy, sandy, or rocky soil. And this is another one that's pretty adaptable to a variety of conditions, provides nectar, pollen, and seeds for different wildlife. This one's in the rose family. You can kind of tell by that flower structure. It's the host to 30 different species of butterflies and moths. Pictured here is the Io moth. Another one, up next we have the American hazelnut. It's another really cool plant. This one is 4 to 15 feet tall, prefers full sun to light shade, moist to dry, mesic, loamy, sandy, or rocky soil. It's pretty adaptable. And this one is a super high, has a super high wildlife value to a whole suite of species. And so it has these nuts, the hazelnuts, but then it also has these catkins that are kind of forming now, and they'll hang on over the winter. It's one of their reproductive structures. And that can actually serve as a food source in addition to the nuts. It's host to 113 different butterflies and moths, so that's a pretty huge number. One of the cooler ones here is the royal walnut moth, also known as the hickory horn devil. And I believe someone kind of had posted one of these recently as well. It's really, really interesting looking caterpillar. And then the nuts themselves are used by several different birds, kind of our larger songbirds, because those are pretty good size and would require pretty heavy bill to crack them open. And then, as I mentioned, the catkins and also the buds will provide food in winter for different birds. It's also used by several mammals. Beavers will eat the stems and use it to construct their lodges. And in addition to the food resource, it also provides cover and good nesting habitat for various songbirds as well. So one of the things that is kind of unfortunate is that we don't have really any native evergreen shrubs, like, apart from northern Illinois that has kind of on the southern range, most portion of the range of the Canada yew. Down here, we don't really have any shrubs that are evergreen that would serve as kind of a screen or a border. One thing, if you do end up choosing Canada yew, you should consider that the parts of those plants are toxic. But there are a couple evergreen shrubs native to nearby regions that you might consider. So the mountain laurel is one from the Appalachian region, and then inkberry, which is native more to the southeast US. And I see that one cited as a potential alternative to something like the European boxwood, something like that, be used as a screen on a border or something like that. Another possibility is, instead of shrubs, if you're looking for an evergreen alternative or a screen alternative, one thing you might consider is the giant reed, or the native cane, as it's sometimes called. Always kind of wanted to do that. My site is never appropriate for that, unfortunately, but it's something you might consider. You do want to be careful. There's an invasive species called giant cane, or rhododendronax, and there are several non-native bamboo species that can become invasive, so you want to avoid those and go for the native giant reed. There are a number of trees that you might consider for that purpose. Of course, they're going to be much taller in most cases. The eastern red cedar, shortleaf pine. American holly is native just kind of southeast of us. It's been kind of creeping into some of our natural areas. I know some folks have expressed some concern over that. I'm not sure how that's going to go, but I guess we'll see. And then if you're just looking for some green interest over the winter season, green foliage, the Christmas fern could be a good potential for that purpose. And before I close out here, I just want to say to beware of some of these pitfalls. There are a lot of non-native plants that are heavily promoted that are considered invasive species. One I mentioned earlier was the burning bush. The Callery pear also has many different varieties, the Bradford pear, Cleveland pear, aristocrat. Those are all different varieties of the Callery pear that are increasingly recognized as being invasive in natural areas. Leatherleaf mahonia is one that I've started seeing pop up occasionally here in southernmost Illinois. Heavenly bamboo, or nandina, is one that's very problematic just south and west of us, especially in Arkansas, and now recently it's being seen more in Missouri, popping up in natural areas, Japanese barberry, and some others. So just be careful where you're going out to avoid picking up an invasive plant. Some species that are sold under one name can actually be a different invasive species. So there was a study that found 54% of plants labeled as American bittersweet were actually Oriental bittersweet. And it's pretty difficult to tell, especially when the plants are younger. When they mature a little more and they put on flowers and berries, they're a little easier to tell apart, but when they're young, it can be a challenge. So if you do end up going for a bittersweet vine, it's something to pay attention to. and kind of monitor over time to make sure. I already mentioned too, some invasives can have similar names and or be in the same genus as native species. The big one there I mentioned is the euonymus. So the euonymus genus can have both native and non-native invasive plants in that genus. There are probably a couple others as well. So with that, I'm going to close out here and leave up a few of the references that I found useful in this effort, and I'll open it up to questions.
Great, thanks a bunch, Kevin. So I'm going to encourage people, if they have questions, go ahead and type them into our chat box. One that came in, somebody, and this was actually somebody from Batavia, Illinois, said they planted 3 spicebush back in their woods about 2 years ago, and they've died back in the winters, but came and grew back since then, but they haven't flowered. And so they're thinking about moving them. They may not have enough sun. They're wanting ideas about that. And I did have a chance to look it up, and Batavia is right on the northern edge of the native range for spicebush.
Yeah, and that right there might be the issue. I'm not sure if the conditions you mentioned would be hampering it. I mean, spicebush can handle quite heavy shade in general. You know, if it's extreme shade, that could be a problem. You might consider moving it or opening it up near there. But generally, they're able to handle a pretty wide range. I bet it is that it's kind of on the northern extent of the range, I'm guessing.
Okay. We had a question about propagation of native shrubs. What are the techniques for doing that? Kind of, if somebody's interested in it, how do they approach that?
Yeah, well, I'm just now getting into that myself, but it's going to vary depending on the species. You know, some species are easily propagated just by using the seed from those plants. So for example, like I mentioned, the indigo bush I collected seed from, those are pretty easy to propagate from seed. Hazelnuts I've done a couple of years now and had really decent success with that. But hazelnuts is another one that you can use stem cuttings or a process called layering. Really, it depends on the species and what you have available, but there's a lot of really good information on the internet. If you have a particular species in mind and you just do a search, propagation of XYZ, you'll probably have some really good recommendations there.
All right, great. Somebody asked about information regarding planting rates if they're doing this not as an ornamental but for wildlife habitat. And then I'll just add, what about plant material? Like, where can you pick up plant material for these kind of more wildlife plantings and things like that?
Well, that's a great question. There are a lot of resources out there for native seed. So I can't think of too many specifics offhand, but if you do like a search of native seed sources in the Midwest, I'm sure something like that would pop up. And then another place I like for woody plants is native plant societies, groups like Wild Ones, stuff like that. They'll frequently have native shrubs if you're looking for container plants in particular. In terms of seed, there are a lot of different nurseries provide that native seed, and you just have to look and find one that's local to your region or online.
All right, great. A relevant announcement, I guess, would be on October 3, Keep Carbondale Beautiful and Green Earth are having a native plant sale in Carbondale for those of you that are in Southern Illinois, both shrubs and herbaceous plants and trees, I think. So great source right there.
Perfect.
So any concern about some of these being clonal species or spreading if somebody wants to plant them in an ornamental setting? Do some of them run or cause problems?
Yeah, yeah, you'll run into that with a few probably. Elderberry is one that can get kind of unruly. Um, Offhand, oh, the Hercules Club can do that. Um, those are a couple that I covered today that I could think of. I would just say to do your research beforehand. Make sure that that's not going to be an issue for you.
Okay. Some more questions just coming in here too. Some people are commenting about particular species that run. Somebody asked about how are invasive plants determined? Question about aren't some invasives valuable? Is there a list about what is native and things like that? Kind of how is that native versus invasive process or determination?
Well, invasive plants, as opposed to just non-native plants that don't become invasive, there is a distinction there. You know, there are a lot of plants that are brought in from outside areas that you can use in your landscaping, and they're never an issue. They don't escape and overrun a site. So basically, when I use the term invasive, I mean it is problematic in one way or another, whether it's to people and their use of an area or to the ecology of an area. So there's definitely a distinction there between non-native invasive and non-native that doesn't become invasive. I always just feel that there are enough native plants personally that will suit our purpose. And, you know, even if a non-native isn't invasive at the moment, sometimes that changes over time. So why not err on the side of caution? That's how I feel about it personally.